Alright, so hi everybody, welcome, and thanks for coming to this book launch reading and Q&A for my book Rise of Knight and Sword. So before I start, I have a few thank yous I wanted to say. So first of all, I want to thank everybody who supported me on this journey through writing, editing, and everything with the book. I also want to thank Caitlin and Amanda for taking time from their busy schedules to make art for the book. Pretty cool art. I really appreciate everything they did with that. And also for Lauren for designing the cover art of the novel, and to Ryan for all the IT work he's done, helping me with my website and my store, and also just for being there and encouraging me every step of the way. And most of all, I want to thank my publisher, Zenith Publishing, and the entire team there for seeing the potential in my book and making it what it is today. So I'm going to go ahead and read a chapter from the novel, and then after that I'll do some Q&As. So if you have any questions you want to ask, feel free to put them in the comments during the reading, and then I'll answer those after. Alright. Chapter 2. Scotch. Neat, Mordred said in a gruff voice as he sat down on a stool at the end of the bar. The pub was a smallish establishment, split lengthwise by a half flight of stairs and an open railing. The bar counter was on the upper floor, covering the entire right wall. Behind it were brightly illuminated shelves, lined with a collection of numerous drinks and mixers. Except for this display, the lighting in the pub was poor, and a smoky haze hung over the establishment. Several patrons were scattered throughout the dingy room at high-top tables. Most were sipping drinks, some were playing cards, and no one was eating. Mordred's Scotch came, and he slammed it back. "Hit me again," he said before the bartender even had a chance to move. Startled by his forceful persona, the bartender nervously bumped into his coworker in a way that made him seem new to the job. Glass shattered when they collided, but no one turned to look. A gust of cool autumn air blew through the open back door of the pub. Beyond it, a second-story deck sat, occupied only by leaves for the season. The breeze could not penetrate the smoke of the room, smelling like a mixture of fresh rain and tobacco. The bartender returned with the drink and quickly retreated. Mordred took a swig and turned his gaze around the bar. A lone man sat at the other end, looking as if he hadn't slept in weeks. His hair was unkempt and his outfit was disheveled, the shirt rumpled, misbuttoned, and untucked. His face matched the rest of him, bloodshot eyes and dry lips. Mordred got up, his drink in hand, and walked over to him. "Eater Nud," Mordred said, running his metallic left hand through his once black, now mostly gray hair. The internal metal workings of his bionic arm were exposed, the gears turning as he completed the motion. Startled to hear his name, Eater turned to look at who had spoken. Mordred stared back at the man, eyes piercing his soul. "What do you want?" Eater asked suspiciously. "Heard you are a wanted man," Mordred replied. "You've got the wrong guy." Eater spoke rapidly. "I'm innocent. This says differently." Mordred pulled a small metal disc out of his pocket, placing it on the bar. He pressed the top, and the device expanded in a telescopic motion. The side opened up momentarily, revealing intricate machinery. A glass lens flipped out of the opening and snapped to the top of the device. An orange light ignited in the bottom, building in luminance and letting out a high-pitched electric whine. Moments later, an amber beam of light burst forth, and Eater's wanted poster flickered in the air like the mesmerizing sparks of a campfire. "I don't care what you may or may not have done," Mordred continued. "I only care about the bounty offered for your head." Mordred reached for his drink and knocked it down, taking several long gulps. Seeing an opportunity, Eater leaped up but tripped backwards over his stool. Catching himself with his hands on the ground, he prepared to run. Instead of bolting forward with speed, he crumpled headfirst into the arms of a young man who had appeared before him. Eater straightened himself out and brushed off his clothes, disoriented. After a few moments, he he finally noticed the young man staring at him and froze. The young man's features were strong and defined, as if molded from granite. He had dark eyebrows that sloped downwards and a dour expression. Simple black slacks covered his legs, and a brown jacket hung over his upper body perfectly. His coat was pulled back at the sleeve, exposing a black dragon tattoo on the inside of his left forearm. Leather holster straps that held 2 pistols across the strap. Cargo boots caked with mud and dirt were on his feet. A bandana was tied around his neck, ready to be pulled up for cover if needed. The young man grabbed hold of Edern and spun him around to face the bar. "You can let him go, Arthur," Mordred said to the young man. He squeezed the side of the mechanical projector, and it returned to its original form on the counter. Scooping it up, he turned to Edern and growled, "Come, sit and finish your drink before we leave." Edern hesitantly obliged, sitting down. "We can do this one of 2 ways. Either come with us willingly and we will do you no harm, or all bets are off. Personally, I enjoy the second option," Mordred said, moving his jacket back slightly to reveal the gun strapped to his waist. "What will it be?" he asked. Edern sat stiffly, staring at his drink. He hadn't touched it, unable to relax. Looking back over his shoulder, he noticed Arthur standing guard. Edern stared at him for a moment, unmoving. He turned back to the drink and picked it up. Then, as if out of nowhere, he leapt backwards off the chair and threw the glass at Arthur's head. Arthur ducked, and the glass crashed over the balcony. Arthur sharply kicked Edern's left knee. Edern stepped back at the sudden pain, spurting out a flood of swear words. Coming at Arthur again, Edern threw several wild punches. Arthur blocked the first, but out of pure luck for Edern, the second managed to connect with his right eye. Countering, Arthur attacked Edern with a series of sudden blows and knocked him back onto the floor. Edern lay there, gasping for breath. Mordred stood up from his seat and walked over to join Arthur. He stood over Edern, weapons brandished. Arthur pulled out his pistols out of their holsters. Slowly, Edern got to his feet. "You could have just shot him," Mordred told Arthur while he stared straight ahead at Edern. "I have to stay in shape somehow," Arthur replied, smirking. He casually twirled one of his guns around his index finger, then held it and aimed it at Edern. Edern stood in front of the 2 men with his hands up, watching them carefully and waiting for their next move. "Give it a rest. Let's go." Mordred rolled his eyes and motioned toward Edern to move. He began to lead him out of the building, passing fellow patrons. A few people were still preoccupied with an ongoing game of poker, but the majority had noticed the struggle and were raring for action. Some likely wanted to claim the bounty for themselves. Arthur took a moment before joining his companion, walking up to the bar and unloading several loose coins onto the counter. The bartender nodded at him, acknowledging the payment. As Arthur turned back to follow Mordred, a fight broke out on the barroom floor. Quickly he scanned the room for his partner. "And I thought the drinks were good here," he heard someone murmuring next to him. Turning his head slightly to the left, he noticed that this someone was actually a young lady, standing with a drink in hand and smiling up at him. She had layers of flowing golden curls cascading over her shoulders, flawless ivory skin, and stunning blue eyes, brighter than the sky itself. Her eyes could have pierced even the soberest of patrons. "I couldn't say," Arthur replied. "I'm just stopping through." He spotted Mordred and tried to shuffle Edern towards the front of the pub without getting mixed up in the fight. His guns were drawn, prepared to shoot anyone who tried to take away his prize. This tactic kept most of the crowd at bay, who resorted to fighting each other instead. Glasses shattered and liquor sprayed the floor as the mob turned in on each other with alcohol-fueled punches at each other. "Care to join me?" the lady asked, looping her arm through his. She danced her fingers on his dragon tattoo and gazed openly at his sharp jaw, chin, and cheekbones. Arthur turned back to look at her, flashing 2 iridescent eyes, sharp, warm, and blue like the ocean on a summer day, with flecks of silvery light swimming across their surface. His dark eyebrows were fierce, but grateful, and his tousled brown hair was thick and lustrous. Arthur stared blankly at the mysterious figure, enamored with her charm. She reached up and caressed his cheek with her soft hands. He grabbed her wrist, pulling her hand away from his face. "Would you like to?" she asked him. Before Arthur could respond, somebody broke a chair across his shoulders and he staggered to the floor. He grabbed the edge of a table, pushing himself onto his feet. Arthur's head pounded, and a flash of anger rippled across his complexion. "I'm a little busy right now," he said to no one in particular. He fervently looked around the room, trying to spot his assailant. Instead, he spotted Eden, who had somehow escaped and was trying to sneak out of the bar by way of the back patio. Arthur started forward, but somebody grabbed his wrist from behind. He whipped around indignantly, only to find the woman staring back at him. She pressed a note into his palm. "Find me sometime." Arthur nodded. Closing his palm into a fist, she released him, and he charged off to pursue his quarry. Arthur reached the patio door and shouted Eden's name. He was out on the far end of the covered patio, contemplating a jump to the ground below. Eden quickly turned around with fear evident in his eyes. Arthur took a step towards Eden as Mordred joined them on the patio. Eden's eyes darted rapidly between the two men. With only a moment of hesitation, he carelessly leapt off the edge of the patio. Luckily for him, an ample pile of leaves and foliage broke his fall, but the wind was knocked out of his lungs. By the time Eden had collected himself, Mordred had detached the wrist of his metal arm and repelled down the railing on a thin coil of wire. When he had reached the ground, his hands released its grasp, and the coil spooled back into its housing. He stood over Eden, waiting for him to get back on his feet. "Don't try to run again," Mordred said as he twisted his metal wrist and locked it into place. He flexed his arm, making sure all the metal workings were back in place. Satisfied, he grabbed his gun out of his waistband and gruffly lifted Eden by the collar. Taking much more time than the other two, Arthur vaulted to the railing, landing much more gracefully than Eden. "I think a lady was inviting me back to her place," Arthur said as he turned to face Mordred, completely ignoring Eden. "Well, what are you doing out here?" Mordred asked him, as if they hadn't just chased their bounty off a building. "I couldn't let this idiot escape," Arthur explained very reasonably. "I had it covered. You always have some excuse and back out. Eventually you'll have to take someone up on their offer." Mordred dragged Eden by the collar around to the front of the pub. "At least for the company, if not for more." Arthur shrugged. "Let's go," Mordred barked, shoving the barrel of the gun in between Eden's shoulder blades. He stumbled forward with his hands held up in the air. Arthur passed them, and the group walked the short distance to their airship. It was an old Stallion-class vessel with the name Hendrigan painted crudely on the side near the door. Most vessels of this type were used by smugglers to transport their goods. Mordred and Arthur were no different. The gondola of the airship was angular in shape, cutting off near the back of the craft in a straight edge from which a large rudder protruded. 2 fans were mounted on either side of the frame, with short, stubby wings. The trio entered the vessel just aft of the helm. From there, 2 hallways ran lengthwise of the ship, encircling a central mechanical room that housed the boiler. Surrounding it were 4 cabins. The first, and most immediate, had been converted into a makeshift holding cell. Another housed the galley and the lounge, and the last were a pair of crew quarters for Arthur and Mordred. An expansive cargo hold completed the ship, tucked in the aftmost quarter in front of the rudder. The ship was well worn and had seen better days. The varnish on the wooden floor was scratched and worn, caked in layers of dirt tracked in by the crew. The walls, previously covered in new textured paneling, had now begun separating at the seams. Unidentifiable stains patterned the surface. In some places, the paneling had completely disintegrated, exposing the bare metal and rivets of the ship's frame. The ceiling was open, and piping ran in a myriad of directions. They clanked and hissed with pressure from the still active boiler. In the not-so-distant past, the airship had been the top of the line. Now, it was a few bumps away from being sold for scrap. Even so, it was still Arthur's home. The place gave him a warm feeling every time they returned from a job. Mordred guided Eden to the holding cell and stopped at its threshold. Eden hesitantly stepped forward, taking in the space. Their surfaces were an amalgamation of earthen tones, tan walls, off-colored ceiling, brown floor, and almost but not quite beige furniture. There was a small bed sitting against the back wall, accompanied by a rickety chair, both of which looked very uncomfortable. In the corner of the room was a closed-off stall, which was probably the closest thing to a bathroom Eden would have access to. Dissatisfied with his slow progress, Mordred shoved him into the space with the barrel of his gun. Eden stumbled in unwillingly. He spun around to plead with his captors. "I didn't do what they said I did," he said. Mordred stepped towards him, stone-faced. Eden flinched, cowering with his arms in front of his face. With a blunt shove, Mordred lifted Eden up against the wall and pressed his middle arm into his throat. Mordred gradually pushed harder, making it difficult for Eden to breathe. "Be happy that the reward is for you to be delivered alive," he hissed into his ear. Eden tried to speak, but his voice only came out a small squeak. Mordred released his grasp, and Eden slumped to the floor. Mordred walked out of the room and shut the cell door. It closed with a resounding thud. The two men then walked the short distance to the bridge. The helm was surrounded by a glass dome, offering a nearly 180-degree view for the pilot in all directions. Only the nose of the dirigible prevented them from seeing up into the sky. A large captain's chair dominated the space, whose gray fabric upholstery was tattered and coming undone at the seams. The dash in front of it was covered in a variety of steam gauges and mechanical switches. "Chart a course to Avalon," Mordred said as he left the helm. Arthur hung his coat on the headrest and took a seat in the captain's chair. His hands moved quickly across the dash, flipping several switches until the outboard fans roared to life. He pulled back on the throttle and Hendrigan lifted into the air. Once they had reached a decent altitude, the fans pivoted forward and the vessel picked up speed. He brought the airship around and set its bearing by the metal compass built into the dash. Arthur spotted a group of pterodactyls and altered course. They were fierce creatures and he did not want to get entangled in an aerial scuffle. He watched as their triangular formation retreated out of view. Once he had traveled some distance further, he allowed himself to relax and look around. Beneath his feet, the heads of brachiosauruses poked out over the canopy. They watched as his airship passed by them, turning their long necks in a long, sweeping arch. The forest continued on for some time before abruptly ending. The trees were replaced with water, and a bay stretched out to the eastern shores of Avalon. Arthur could just make out Camelot in the distance. It stood on the tallest hill in the northwesternmost corner of the peninsula. Camelot towered over its fledgling sky towers of downtown Avalon. Those structures, having only been constructed at the turn of the century, were mere blips when compared to the castle's storied history. Camelot had been built many kings ago, before Uther, before Constantine, before the city had grown out beneath. Its pristine stone walls looked as if they were untouched by time. Throughout the years, the realms of Avalon had been challenged by foreign armies and rival kings. The castle's survival was due in no small part to its naturally defended position. Just north and west of its foundation were sheer cliffs that steeply descended into the ocean. To the east was a steep ascent that was impassable by mounted forces. This made the only easy approach from the south, from downtown, which was protected by a series of gates leading up the castle hill. I wonder what it's like inside those castle walls. The few times Arthur and Mordred had delivered bounties to the crown, he had waited behind to watch Hendrigan. He rarely left the shipyard during their time in Avalon and let Mordred do most of the talking. The airship crossed over the peninsula, approaching the airfields. Arthur slowed the craft until it hovered over the landing site. As the craft descended from the sky, Arthur looked out over the ocean on the opposite side of the peninsula. Its blue surface sparkled in the sunlight. The view was quickly muddled with other airships descending and rising. When Hendrigan neared the ground, Arthur let loose several mooring lines for the ground crew of the airfield. They pulled the craft in until the vessel made contact with the ground. The ropes were tied off as Arthur shut down the fans. Soon after, Mordred appeared on the bridge. "You should put some ice on that," Mordred said. "Don't want to get a black eye." "I've had worse," Arthur replied. "You were beat up by someone wanted for tax evasion. That's got to be a first." "I didn't get beat up. He landed one punch." Mordred smirked. "Actually, why are you badgering me? You're the one who let Edern get away." Mordred shrugged. "What can I say? The chase helps my reputation. And, unlike you, I don't have a black eye." Arthur rolled his eyes. "I suppose I did recruit you for your piloting skills, not your fighting expertise," Mordred relented. "Recruited? More like you begged me to join. As I recall, you spent several hours pumping me full of whiskey before I finally gave in." Mordred laughed. "That is definitely not how it happened. I'm going to collect our bounty. Stay and watch the ship," he commanded. "As always." Arthur readjusted his position in the captain's chair, lounging back and putting his feet up on the dash. Looking out over the airfield, he could see several airships refueling, loading, and unloading cargo. The whole place bustled with activity. He spotted a large group of rangers patrolling the shipyard, with their weapons at the ready. "That's odd," he noted, before drifting off to sleep in the comfy chair. Alright, so now I'm going to answer some questions that I have from beforehand, but if you guys have any questions, just feel free to send them my way during this. So the first question is, who or what inspired you to become an author? So I guess for this one, I've always really enjoyed writing. So since I was in elementary and middle school aged, I just loved writing, and so it's something that I've just continued to do throughout my life. And so I guess when I started out writing this book, I thought it actually had real potential, and I kind of saw it as an opportunity to see what it could become. Okay, so many people may think that becoming an author is too time-consuming, or they don't have the time to write. Can you touch on how to balance your personal life with being an author? How much of a time commitment was the writing, editing, and publishing process for you? Yeah, so definitely depends on the day, how much time I spend on doing writing or editing or anything. It definitely can take some time, but just like any hobby of yours, if you want to write, you'll find the time to do it. It's kind of like whenever there's a moment of peace, writing. I know for me, I really like writing on airplanes, which, I mean, we haven't done that for a while, but that's always nice because you're kind of just cut off from the rest of the world. So I found that very productive for me. But in terms of balancing it, it's always going to be a challenge, because with anything in your life, it's always a work in progress of balancing your personal life, your job, your hobbies, everything. But if it's important, then you'll make the time for it or find the time somehow. Alright, so then next question is, what, if anything, did you learn about yourself in the process of writing and publishing your novel? I mean, I feel like this is kind of a hard question to think, because there's definitely things I learned about my writing style, and things I learned just about the whole process of publishing, but also just learning a lot of patience, because you just don't know everything all the time, and as you're waiting for things, just learning that skill is good too. And I don't know, I guess that kind of answers that one. Let's see. Oh, here's the one. Do you look up reviews of your novel? If yes, how do you handle the positive and or negative reviews? So yeah, so with this book, I got a lot of advanced reader copy reviews, so it was a pretty big mix of positive and negative ones, and it's definitely never easy to get a negative review. It's hard not to take it personally when it's something that you've poured a lot of time and energy in and you feel really proud about, and then somebody just kind of tears it apart. But it's definitely also just try to take them as a learning moment too, like to see if it's actually has good criticisms to then, use that going forward with my writing. But then there's always going to be people who don't like the writing or the book or the plot or something because it's just not their style, or they had a different expectation on what it was going to be, and so they're disappointed. So I'm trying to not take those personally, and just kind of remember like what success is, because like you're like, oh, I want to have best-selling novel and all 5-star reviews, but when I got this book signed to be published, that alone I felt was incredible, and that alone is a big moment of success, and it doesn't have to be like the bestseller ever or anything for it to be a success. And in terms of positive reviews, it's always great to see those. It's really encouraging when people really like it. It makes me want to keep writing, makes me want to continue the series more and share what I have planned with everyone. And speaking of the series, as this is the first novel in the One Sword Saga, when did you decide to make this a series as opposed to a single novel? So when I started this book a couple years ago, I started it with the intention of writing it as a series. There's just like so much out there in terms of like Arthurian legends to explore, so many different characters that I really wanted to be able to delve in deeper with, and so I didn't think I could really cover all of that in one book, and I really wanted to write more books to explore more characters, to explore more legends and all of that. So when I started this, I figured it'd start with the classic Arthurian legend and then go and expand into some of the more obscure stories that people maybe don't know as much about, and then putting my own flair and twists on them. When writing a series of novels, how does that process look, such as how do you decide how many books the series will be, what information to put in which book, etc.? Yeah, so in terms of like how many books, that's still kind of open-ended for me, because I want to make sure it concludes very well and wraps up, but I don't want it to drag on forever either, so I don't want it to be like 12 books. That's like ridiculously long. But I also want to make sure the story is completely told. So I haven't fully decided how many total that's going to be. But in terms of like what information in each book, this book really introduces a lot of the characters. You really get to know Arthur and Guinevere and really well as you meet the knights of the Round Table as well. And so in the following books, they'll get to see more with the knights and kind of learn more about them as well, and really fully get some more background with them. So yeah, with that. And let's see. And then, so I guess for my last question, it is, what did you find to be the hardest and most challenging part of writing, editing, publishing, and how did you get through it? I mean, each part of the process has its own challenges. Definitely with writing the first draft, and it's hard for me. The hardest part with that is just kind of like making the different pieces of the story connect. So like I have these great ideas for the beginning or the middle or this little scene that I really want to include, but making sure like it all flows cohesively and isn't just completely just random little blurbs here and there. And in terms of editing, that's definitely my most challenging part. I think that's probably true for most authors, because it's hard to like tear apart something you just made, and you're like very proud of it. But it only gets better with editing. And I think the hardest part is with editing is I so deep in my writing, so like read it so many times, it's easy to like breeze through mistakes and not see them, or to be like, well, of course this makes sense because I know, and I'm not like an outside person reading it, where it might not make sense because they don't have the whole background yet. And so that can be really challenging, just to take myself away from it for a moment to see it from an outside perspective. And in terms of with publishing, I think the hardest part with that is like getting to get a publisher to accept you. Definitely going through that querying process is very hard, because you get a lot of rejections, a lot of just form emails sent back, and that can be really, really hard because you begin to doubt yourself a lot, and that can be hard. Like, why did I do this? And I guess that kind of goes back with the thing I was talking about with like the reviews. It's kind of like, well, you did it. You wrote a novel. That of its own is amazing and successful. And then if someone wants to publish it, that's even better. So I want to thank you guys all for joining me for this. I hope you've ordered your copy and enjoy it. And if you enjoy it, everything, do feel free to leave reviews on Amazon, Goodreads, or wherever you purchase the book. That really helps it get more visibility to a wider audience. But yeah, thank you guys for joining me, and enjoy the rest of your night.